In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, nestled among the rugged hills of the Hijaz, stood the ancient city of Mecca. It was a city of intense contrasts, home to both sacred tradition and a society rife with tribal rivalries, injustice, and spiritual darkness. Yet, amid this complexity, Mecca was also the site of the Kaaba, a revered sanctuary believed to have been built by the prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael. Pilgrims came from all corners of Arabia to worship there, although over time the sanctuary had become burdened with idols and corrupted rituals. The city was ruled by the powerful tribe of Quraysh, who held guardianship over the Kaaba and exercised considerable influence through their wealth, trade, and political alliances. It was into this environment that the Prophet Muhammad was born, in the year that would later be known as the Year of the Elephant. That year, a significant event had taken place which the people of Mecca remembered with awe and pride. An invading army from Yemen, led by the Christian governor Abraha, had sought to destroy the Kaaba and redirect pilgrimage toward his own grand cathedral in Sana'a. Abraham marched with a mighty force that included elephants, unheard of in Arabia. But before the army could reach Mecca, it was said to have been miraculously destroyed. Birds pelted the invaders with stones, and disease ravaged their ranks. This event, remembered vividly by the Arabs, marked the year of Muhammad's birth and was considered a divine sign that Mecca, and the Kaaba within it, was protected by God. Muhammad's lineage was noble and honored. He was a descendant of the prophet Abraham through his son Ishmael, whose progeny had settled in Arabia and preserved aspects of Abrahamic tradition. Within this lineage, the tribe of Quraysh had emerged as one of the most respected, and within Quraysh, the clan of Banu Hashim held a reputation for integrity and generosity. Muhammad's grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, was a chief of Mecca and custodian of the Kaaba, a man of dignity and foresight. His father, Abdullah, was known for his upright character, though his life was tragically short. Before Muhammad was born, Abdullah had traveled on a trade journey to the north and died on the return trip in Yathrib, the city that would one day become Medina. He never saw his son. Thus, Muhammad was born into a world of loss. His mother, Amina, gave birth to him in her modest home in Mecca. She named him Muhammad, a name that was rare among the Arabs but carried a profound meaning. It signified one who is praised repeatedly, someone whose qualities command admiration. There are accounts that suggest Amina experienced unusual signs during her pregnancy, sensing that her child was destined for greatness, though she herself could not have foreseen the magnitude of the life he would live. Amina was left to raise her son alone, but according to the customs of the time, Muhammad was soon entrusted to a Bedouin wet nurse. This was a common practice among Meccan families, who believed that life in the desert offered children physical strength, eloquence of speech, and a connection with nature. Muhammad was taken by a woman named Halima from the tribe of Banu Sa'd. It is said that from the moment Halima took him into her care, her household was blessed. Her animals produced more milk, her land yielded more bounty, and her family felt the presence of something extraordinary. During his years with Halima, Muhammad was known for his calm demeanor and gentle nature. He was not prone to mischief, and those around him remarked on the serenity that seemed to envelop him. One day, however, something startling occurred. While he was playing with other children, Halima's son rushed to her in alarm. He claimed that two men had taken Muhammad, opened his chest, and removed something from it. Fearing for the boy's life, Halima and her husband rushed to find him. They saw Muhammad unharmed, but he appeared pale and quiet. This incident, which would later be understood as the cleansing of his heart by angels, left a lasting impression on Halima. Though deeply attached to him, she decided to return him to his mother, fearing for his safety and unsure of the mysterious event she had witnessed. Back in Mecca, Muhammad lived with his mother Amina. She loved her son dearly, but their time together was short. When Muhammad was around 6 years old, Amina took him on a journey to Yathrib to visit the grave of his father and connect him with his paternal relatives. The journey was long and difficult, but it offered a brief moment of familial bonding. On the return trip, however, tragedy struck. Amina fell gravely ill and passed away in a remote village called Abwa. Muhammad was left without mother or father, an orphan in the truest sense. After Amina's death, Muhammad came under the care of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. The old chief loved his grandson deeply. He recognized something special in the boy, and it is said that he gave him a place of honor even among his own sons. Abdul Muttalib would seat Muhammad beside him at the Kaaba, a spot reserved for the elders of Quraysh. Despite his age and the responsibilities he bore, he doted on the child and ensured that he was treated with respect and kindness. But this too was a temporary haven. When Muhammad was 8 years old, his grandfather passed away. With the death of Abdul Muttalib, guardianship of Muhammad passed to his paternal uncle Abu Talib, a respected but financially struggling member of the Quraysh. Abu Talib embraced this responsibility wholeheartedly. Though not wealthy, he protected and cared for his nephew as if he were his own son. Muhammad grew up in Abu Talib's household, learning the values of loyalty, generosity, and courage. He accompanied his uncle on trade caravans, observing the ways of merchants, the customs of foreign lands, and the injustice that pervaded much of the Arabian society. Despite the many losses he had endured by the age of 8, Muhammad grew up to become a young man of striking character. His honesty, reliability, and sense of fairness were evident even in his youth. He bore the weight of orphanhood not with bitterness, but with a sense of quiet resolve. Those around him were drawn to his gentle speech and trustworthiness. They gave him the title Al-Amin, the trustworthy, long before he ever claimed to be a prophet. These early years, marked by hardship, loss, and a series of caring guardians, shaped Muhammad's personality in profound ways. The pain of being an orphan helped to nurture his deep empathy for the vulnerable. The dignity of his grandfather and the compassion of his uncle modeled for him a leadership style rooted in honor and protection. The simplicity of the desert and the vibrancy of the city both played roles in his understanding of humanity. Without yet speaking a word of revelation, the prophet's life was already a testament to grace under pressure and strength forged through adversity. The early loss of both parents and his grandfather left Muhammad with no memory of parental comfort or maternal protection. Yet in the home of his uncle Abu Talib, he found a new sense of belonging. Abu Talib was a man of firm character and generous spirit, known in Mecca for his kindness and sense of duty. Though he was not among the wealthier members of the Quraysh, he had great respect among his peers and loved his nephew deeply. Muhammad lived with Abu Talib as one of his own sons, and though the family had modest means, they shared what they had and never allowed their circumstances to diminish their dignity. In his uncle's household, Muhammad was immersed in the realities of Meccan society. He witnessed the daily rhythms of tribal life, the complicated network of alliances and rivalries that shaped political decisions, and the harsh inequalities that divided the wealthy elite from the poor and enslaved. He saw the way idols were honored in the Kaaba while the weak were disregarded, and though he never spoke out in his youth, it was clear even then that he found no satisfaction in the prevailing customs. His eyes absorbed everything, and though he remained quiet and respectful, his heart developed a sense of justice and a deep sympathy for the oppressed. From a young age, Muhammad began to accompany his uncle on trade journeys. These were not merely commercial ventures, they were opportunities for cultural and moral education. Travel took him beyond the boundaries of Mecca, across the deserts, and into the markets and towns of Greater Arabia and beyond. On these journeys, he saw people of various faiths and customs. He observed Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and pagans, each with their own traditions and scriptures. These interactions left impressions on him, but he was never drawn toward the ornate rituals or theological complexities of these groups. Instead, he quietly held to the memory of the one God that Abraham had once called to. He remained spiritually alert, but unattached to the fragmented practices around him. Despite being raised in a society known for tribal arrogance and personal pride, Muhammad's character set him apart from his peers. He was known for his gentle nature, his humility, and his complete honesty. People trusted him instinctively, and as he grew into adolescence, he became someone to whom others would turn for advice or mediation. He did not lie, cheat, or exploit. He avoided the wild gatherings and immoral celebrations that were common among Meccan youth. When asked later in life why he had abstained from the excesses of his time, he would reply that his heart had never found joy in such things. It was as if he had been protected from them by an unseen hand. There are stories from this time in his life that reflect his early concern for fairness. On one occasion, he joined in a tribal alliance known as the Hilf al-Fudul, formed by leading families of Mecca to defend the rights of the oppressed. This pact was not established for political gain or commercial advantage, but was a rare agreement among rival clans to protect the weak from injustice, especially when such wrongs were committed by powerful merchants or tribal leaders. Muhammad later recalled his participation in that alliance with pride, saying that even after the advent of Islam, he would not hesitate to honor such a pact if it were still in effect. This willingness to stand for the dignity of others, even without any social reward, was an early mark of the character that would one day carry the burden of prophethood. While many of his contemporaries became entangled in the endless tribal disputes or consumed with their pursuits of wealth and status, Muhammad remained content with simplicity. He learned the value of labor, assisting his uncle with trade caravans and later working for others as a shepherd. Tending sheep may seem humble work to most, but for Muhammad, it was a training ground for patience and leadership. He once remarked that every prophet had served as a shepherd, a role that teaches compassion, attentiveness, and the gentle firmness needed to guide without harming. Alone among the hills, with the animals under his care and the sky stretching wide above him, he nurtured a quiet connection to creation and to the Creator. As the years passed, Muhammad continued to earn a reputation for integrity. Meccan society, though deeply flawed, was not without admiration for virtuous conduct. Wealth and bloodline were often revered, but character also carried weight, and Muhammad's character was such that people began to call him Al-Amin, the trustworthy. The title was not a hollow phrase. Merchants would entrust him with their goods, knowing that he would return every coin and measure honestly. Disputes were brought to him because his judgment was never tainted by partiality or greed. Even those who disagreed with him politically or philosophically would later acknowledge that they never caught him in a lie. There were moments that hinted at the future role he would play, though he himself remained unaware of what lay ahead. One such incident occurred during the reconstruction of the Kaaba. The tribes of Mecca had agreed to rebuild the sacred sanctuary after it had been damaged, but a dispute arose when it came time to place the black stone back in its corner. Each clan believed it had the right to perform this sacred task, and the disagreement escalated to the brink of violence. In an attempt to avoid bloodshed, someone suggested that the next person to enter the courtyard be asked to decide. That person happened to be Muhammad. When the people saw him, they rejoiced, saying that Al-Amin had come and that he would make a fair judgment. Muhammad did not disappoint them. Rather than favor one tribe over another, he proposed a solution that satisfied all. He placed the stone on a cloth and asked the leaders of each tribe to lift it together. Once they carried it to the designated spot, he himself positioned the stone in place. This act not only diffused a volatile situation, but demonstrated his wisdom, humility, and commitment to peace. It was a moment that affirmed the special place he held in the hearts of his people. Yet for all his honor and recognition, Muhammad remained humble and reserved. He did not seek to rise above others or claim privileges. His lifestyle was modest, and his presence was gentle rather than commanding. Those who met him were struck by his sincerity, his attentiveness when spoken to, and the calm steadiness of his demeanor. Though he had seen hardship in his youth, he carried no bitterness. He did not raise his voice in anger or mock those who had less. His words were thoughtful, and his silence was as expressive as his speech. He lived in a society in need of moral renewal, and though he had not yet received divine revelation, he was already living as a model of ethical conduct. In a time when falsehood, exploitation, and spiritual confusion were rampant, he stood as a quiet beacon of truth, compassion, and clarity. This early phase of his life, shaped by the pain of orphanhood, the discipline of labor, and the strength of moral integrity, laid the foundation for the immense trust that God would soon place upon his shoulders. As Muhammad entered his mid-20s, the qualities that had marked him since childhood had only deepened with age. He had grown into a man of noble character, a presence both calming and commanding, and his reputation for honesty had earned him respect not only within his own tribe but among neighboring communities. Mecca was a bustling center of commerce, where caravans flowed through from the north and south, bringing with them goods, ideas, and stories from distant lands. In this environment, trust was a rare and valuable currency, and Muhammad was one of the few who possessed it in full measure. It was during this time that the eyes of a wealthy and influential woman of Mecca turned toward him. Her name was Khadijah bint Khuwaylid. A widow twice over, Khadijah was a businesswoman of exceptional intelligence and strength. Though society generally placed men at the forefront of trade and finance, Khadijah had taken the reins of her late husband's business and turned it into one of the most successful commercial enterprises in the region. She was known not only for her wealth but for her dignity and discretion, and though many noblemen had sought her hand in marriage, she had declined them all. Khadijah, ever discerning in her choice of business partners, had heard of Muhammad's integrity and skill in trade. She needed someone she could trust to manage her caravan to Syria, a journey that required negotiation, endurance, and the kind of scrupulous honesty that was hard to find. She sent a message to Muhammad through an intermediary, offering him employment to manage her trade expedition in exchange for a share of the profits greater than what she typically paid. Muhammad accepted the offer and prepared for the journey northward, accompanied by one of Khadijah's servants, a young man named Mecca, who was tasked with observing and assisting. The journey to Syria was successful in every sense. Muhammad proved to be not only a skilled negotiator and manager of goods, but also someone whose presence brought prosperity. Mecca, who watched him closely throughout the journey, was deeply impressed by Muhammad's behavior. He witnessed not only his business acumen, but his kindness, his calm under pressure, and his refusal to engage in the dishonest dealings that were common among traders. There were even incidents during the trip that seemed touched by grace. Some say that a monk they encountered on the road recognized signs of something extraordinary in Muhammad's manner. Others noted that the heat of the desert sun seemed less oppressive when he walked, as if the heavens themselves were mindful of him. When they returned to Mecca, Mecca gave Khadijah a full report of what he had seen. His words were not only those of a servant recounting the profits of a caravan, but those of a witness to a character both rare and beautiful. Khadijah listened and was moved. The image of Muhammad that emerged from Mecca's account confirmed what she had suspected. This was no ordinary man. Over the weeks that followed, her admiration grew into something deeper. She confided in a friend, who then approached Muhammad discreetly to ask whether he might consider marriage if such a proposal came his way. Muhammad, who had not previously considered marriage due to his modest means and the responsibilities he carried, did not object. He respected Khadijah greatly and recognized her wisdom and virtue. Khadijah, though 15 years his senior, felt no hesitation. She sent a formal proposal, and soon after, they were married. The union was simple and sincere, celebrated not with extravagance but with joy among family and friends. For Muhammad, the marriage to Khadijah would become the most significant relationship of his life. It was built not on wealth or ambition but on mutual respect, affection, and a shared commitment to integrity. She became his confidant, his supporter, and the mother of his children. In her, he found both emotional warmth and intellectual companionship. Their home was a place of peace, far removed from the pride and rivalry that permeated much of Meccan society. Over the years, Khadijah bore him several children. The sons Qasim and Abdullah died in infancy, a sorrow that weighed heavily on both parents. But their daughters Zainab, Ruqayya, Kulthum, and Fatima grew up in a household rooted in love, compassion, and truth. Muhammad was a tender father, involved in the lives of his children, teaching them by example and offering them the kind of presence he himself had longed for as an orphan. Though Muhammad's marriage gave him greater stability and standing in the community, he did not become complacent. He continued to work as a merchant, traveling and managing trade on behalf of others as well as for his own household. His dealings were marked by precision and fairness. He never overcharged, never made false claims, and never exploited the ignorance of others. People knew that entering a transaction with Muhammad meant they would be treated with honesty. This consistency only deepened the respect he commanded in Mecca. Even those who disagreed with his beliefs in later years never questioned his character. As he matured, Muhammad's heart became increasingly sensitive to the moral and spiritual decay that surrounded him. He saw how the idols in the Kaaba were powerless pieces of stone, yet people prostrated before them, offering sacrifices and seeking blessings. He watched as the wealthy grew wealthier and the poor were trampled upon. Orphans, like he once had been, were neglected. Women were treated as property, and the birth of daughters was viewed as a disgrace. Tribalism fueled endless feuds, and the strong preyed upon the weak without fear of consequence. Muhammad did not yet speak out against these injustices, but they weighed on him. He began to seek solitude, retreating into the hills around Mecca. One cave in particular, called Hijrah, became his refuge. There, in the stillness of the mountains, he would sit for hours or even days, contemplating the state of the world and searching for meaning. He would take provisions with him and reflect in silence, gazing at the stars and wondering about the purpose of life, the nature of the divine, and the path toward righteousness. It was not escape that he sought, but clarity. At home, Khadijah supported him without question. She respected his need for contemplation and never accused him of neglect or eccentricity. She saw in him a man of profound thought, and she gave him the space and encouragement to explore that depth. Her love was not possessive but nurturing. She prepared his provisions, waited patiently for his return, and welcomed him with warmth when he descended from the mountains. These years, spent in reflection and honest labor, formed the quiet prelude to a life that would soon erupt into divine mission. They were years of preparation, when the foundations of trust, morality, and inward clarity were strengthened. Muhammad was not yet called a prophet, but his life already offered a model of prophetic character. The merchant who never cheated, the husband who cherished his wife, the man who wept for lost children but remained kind to others, the seeker who walked alone under the stars in search of truth. This was the man who would soon be called to rise and speak with the authority of revelation. But before the words came, he had lived them. And that is why, when the message did arrive, it would resonate so deeply. The people would know that the one calling them to truth was a man who had never once departed from it. As the years passed and the burdens of conscience grew heavier, Muhammad began to withdraw more frequently into solitude. The rituals of Mecca, once considered sacred, now appeared hollow and misguided to his discerning heart. The gods of wood and stone that adorned the Kaaba inspired no reverence in him. He saw people fall to their knees before lifeless idols while neglecting the hungry, cheating the poor, and burying their daughters in shame. The city around him was filled with voices that praised wealth and lineage, but few spoke of justice, mercy, or truth. And so he climbed the hills above Mecca to seek silence and meaning in the caves and shadows of the mountains. There was one cave to which he returned again and again. It lay in the rugged face of Mount Hira, just outside the city. There he found the solitude his heart craved. He would carry food and water with him and remain for days in quiet reflection. Sometimes he fasted, and other times he simply sat in silence, his mind turning over the questions that had no answers. He would look out over the valley, at the lights of Mecca in the distance, and wonder what would become of a people so distant from the path of Abraham. He had heard stories of earlier prophets, of Moses and Jesus, of men chosen by God to guide their nations, and he believed that a truth lay behind those stories. Though the details had become clouded by time and conflicting traditions, in those moments alone beneath the stars, he searched not for fame or authority, but for certainty. He was a man unshaped by pride, but deeply stirred by suffering. The orphan in him had never forgotten the weight of abandonment, nor had the traitor forgotten the trust placed in him by others. He was content with his life as a husband, a father, and a man respected by his community, yet something within him remained unsettled. The world cried out for a justice that could not be found in its idols, and his soul trembled before a creator whose will he longed to understand. In the month of Ramadan, the air over Mecca grew still and warm. On one of those nights, as he sat in the quiet of the cave, something happened that he could never have expected nor fully described. Without warning, the darkness was pierced by a presence that filled the cave with a light and force that overwhelmed him. A figure stood before him, neither shadow nor dream. He later spoke of it as the angel Jibreel, the same messenger who had come to prophets before him. But in that moment, he was filled not with understanding but with fear and awe. The angel spoke a single command: "Read." Muhammad, startled and trembling, replied that he could not read. The command came again: "Read." He gave the same answer, overwhelmed by the strangeness of the moment. Then for a third time the voice spoke, firm but not cruel: "Read, in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. Read, and your Lord is most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he knew not." The words seemed to burn themselves into his heart. They were not spoken by his own tongue, but they filled his being as if they had always lived within him, waiting to be awakened. His breath came fast and heavy, and the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. When the angel left and the silence returned, Muhammad stumbled out of the cave and descended the mountain. His legs were unsteady, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. The world around him looked unchanged, yet he knew that nothing could ever be the same again. He hurried back to his home in Mecca, where Khadijah waited. When she saw the fear in his eyes and the pallor in his face, she ran to him without hesitation. He asked her to wrap him in a cloak, and she did so, holding him as he trembled. When at last he could speak, he told her what had happened, that he had seen something beyond this world, that he had heard words that did not come from his own mind, that he feared for his sanity or even his life. Her response was neither doubt nor alarm. She listened carefully, and with the firmness of love, reminded him of the man he was. She told him that God would never disgrace someone like him. He honored his family, cared for the orphan, gave to the poor, and carried the burdens of those in need. He spoke the truth, kept his promises, and turned away from corruption. How could a man like that be abandoned or deceived? She saw in him what others had long seen, and more. To her, the revelation was not a sign of madness, but of a divine calling that had finally reached its appointed hour. Still seeking confirmation, Khadijah took him to visit her cousin Waraka ibn Nawfal, a learned man who had studied the scriptures of the Jews and Christians. When Muhammad described his experience, Waraka grew solemn. He said that the being who had come to him was the same spirit who had come to Moses. He warned that this was the beginning of a great mission, and that it would not be easy. He predicted that Muhammad would be rejected by his people, exiled from his homeland, and burdened with the message he had been given. Muhammad listened in silence. The words echoed with both gravity and truth. In the days that followed, the fear began to subside, but the awe remained. The revelation had ceased for a time, and he began to wonder whether it had been real or whether he had done something to displease his Lord. He would return to the cave again, seeking further clarity. Then, once again, the angel returned. This time, Muhammad saw him filling the horizon, immense and glorious. Wherever he looked, the angel was there, and he spoke again with the same authority. This second encounter confirmed that the first had not been an illusion. It was the beginning of revelation, and Muhammad knew now that it had not come to crush him but to uplift and guide him. He did not rush into public preaching. He began first with those closest to him. Khadijah accepted the message without hesitation. His cousin Ali, still a boy, also believed. His adopted son Zayd and his close friend Abu Bakr soon followed. They were not forced or persuaded by eloquence, but drawn by the truth they recognized in the words and in the man who delivered them. These early followers did not gain status or reward. On the contrary, they risked everything to stand beside a man who claimed to speak in the name of the one God. Muhammad's life had turned from that of a trusted merchant to a messenger of divine truth. His days of solitude were now over. He would no longer sit in the quiet of the cave, but walk among people with words that challenged their assumptions and called them to something greater. The burden was great, but he carried it with the quiet strength of one who had seen what others had not. and could not turn away from what he now knew to be real. As the quiet revelation blossomed into a mission, the city of Mecca stirred with unease. What had begun in the seclusion of a mountain cave now unfolded in the heart of the most sacred and proud city in Arabia. The message that Muhammad carried was not merely a spiritual reflection or a call to private piety. It was a direct challenge to the beliefs, power structures, and social customs that shaped Meccan life. To say that God was one, and that he alone was worthy of worship may have sounded simple, but those words unsettled centuries of tradition and touched the foundations of a society rooted in tribal pride and idol reverence. Muhammad did not climb a pulpit or shout through the streets. He moved carefully, quietly, at first calling only those close to him. Khadijah remained his constant supporter, encouraging him when his heart grew heavy and standing beside him when others turned away. His cousin Ali, though still a boy, accepted the message with unwavering loyalty. Zayd ibn Haritha, who had lived in Muhammad's household since childhood, pledged himself to the new faith. Abu Bakr, a man of noble descent and deep wisdom, believed in him instantly and used his influence to bring others into the fold. These early believers formed a small but resolute circle. They had no mosques or minarets, no wealth or military force, only their faith and the quiet strength that flowed from the words Muhammad had received. At first, their gatherings were private. They met in homes and secluded places, away from the noise of the markets and the scrutiny of the Quraysh leaders. One such home belonged to a man named Al-Arqam, and it became a refuge for the growing community. There, Muhammad taught them what he had learned. He recited the verses that came to him, sometimes in the stillness of the night, sometimes in the early light of dawn. The verses were unlike anything the Arabs had heard before. They spoke with a power that stirred the heart, rich in beauty and meaning, calling people not only to believe but to reflect, to act, and to live justly. But truth, even when spoken gently, often provokes resistance. The Quraysh, proud custodians of the Kaaba and guardians of Mecca's religious and commercial life, soon took notice. At first, they dismissed Muhammad's message as harmless. Let him preach to a few dreamers, they said. He will tire of it, and his followers will fade. But when they saw the effect his words had on the people, when slaves and noblemen alike stood side by side in prayer, when men and women wept at the sound of divine verses and turned away from idols they had once honored, their amusement turned to alarm. Muhammad was not simply introducing a new belief, he was unraveling their authority. The Kaaba, which had become a center of idol worship and tribal pilgrimage, brought prestige and wealth to the Quraysh. Each idol had its worshippers, each festival its merchants and vendors. The unity of God threatened not only their gods, but their economy and power. Worse still, Muhammad did not limit his message to the unseen. He spoke of the equality of all human beings, of the dignity of slaves and the rights of the poor. He condemned the burying of infant girls, the hoarding of wealth, and the unjust treatment of orphans. These were not abstract philosophies. They were indictments of the very system the elite depended upon. The opposition began with words. The leaders of Quraysh tried to reason with Abu Talib, asking him to restrain his nephew. They offered Muhammad wealth, leadership, and even marriage to the finest women of Mecca if only he would stop preaching. Muhammad replied with quiet resolve. If they placed the sun in his right hand and the moon in his left, he said, he would not abandon the message. Abu Talib, though not a believer, recognized the depth of his nephew's commitment and refused to hand him over to his enemies. When persuasion failed, persecution began. The Quraysh focused first on the weak and vulnerable. Bilal, an Ethiopian slave who had accepted Islam, was dragged into the desert and beaten under the scorching sun. His master placed heavy stones on his chest and mocked his cries. But Bilal refused to recant. He repeated the word Ahad, one, over and over until his voice faded into silence. Others suffered similar fates. Ammar ibn Yasir, his father Yasir, and his mother Sumayya were tortured for their faith. Sumayya became the first martyr of Islam when she was killed by a spear to the heart. Even those of noble lineage were not spared. Uthman ibn Affan, a member of the powerful Umayyad clan, was mocked and threatened. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, one of the early converts, was struck while praying. Yet the believers remained firm. Their faith was not based on promises of power or protection. It was rooted in a certainty that no force could extinguish. They gathered at night to pray, their voices soft but their hearts ablaze with conviction. Each new verse revealed through Muhammad nourished their spirits and gave them courage. The Quran became their lifeline, reminding them that truth has always faced opposition, that even the prophets before them were mocked and tested, and that victory belongs not to those who wield swords but to those who hold firm to justice. Muhammad bore the weight of their suffering with sorrow. He could not prevent every act of cruelty, but he comforted his followers and reminded them that patience in hardship was a path to paradise. He himself faced insults and threats. Men threw dust on him, called him a liar and a madman, and sought to isolate him from his own people. Yet he never responded with anger. He never cursed his enemies or called for their destruction. Instead, he continued to preach with gentleness, to pray in the quiet hours of the night, and to trust that God would guide whom he willed. One day, the leaders of Quraysh gathered again and decided that the growing movement had to be stopped by force. They imposed a social and economic boycott on Muhammad and his supporters, including the entire clan of Banu Hashim. They were exiled to a narrow valley outside Mecca, cut off from trade and aid. Food became scarce, and the cries of hungry children echoed through the night. Yet even in this hardship, the believers did not abandon one another or their faith. Through it all, Muhammad remained the moral center of the community. His compassion did not waver. He shared what little he had, comforted the distressed, and recited the words of God to remind them that every trial had meaning. He did not promise ease, but he promised purpose. He taught that the heart's freedom was greater than any worldly comfort, and that the path to God often runs through hardship. These early years were not marked by conquest or worldly success. They were years of patience, pain, and perseverance. But in that crucible, a community was formed unlike any that had existed before in Arabia. It was not bound by tribe or blood, but by faith and shared struggle. And at its heart stood a man who had once been an orphan, a merchant, and now a messenger, whose voice continued to call people not toward him but toward the one who had sent him. The years of the early mission had carved deep marks into the lives of those who followed Muhammad. What had begun as a message of hope and clarity soon met the stone walls of resistance and cruelty. But no period was as heavy or as testing as the years of the boycott and the personal tragedies that followed. These moments would bring Muhammad to the very edge of sorrow, yet even there, he found strength in his unwavering trust in God. The Quraysh, frustrated by their failure to halt the spread of Islam through threats and violence, devised a new strategy. They resolved to isolate Muhammad and his entire clan, the Banu Hashim, from Meccan society. Though not all members of the clan were Muslims, tribal loyalty meant that they stood by him nonetheless. The Quraysh formalized their plan in a written agreement, hung it inside the Kaaba for all to see. They vowed not to marry into the Banu Hashim, not to trade with them, not to visit them, and not to offer them protection or support until they surrendered Muhammad to the Quraysh's will. Forced from their homes, Muhammad, his family, his companions, and the entire Banu Hashim sought shelter in a narrow valley outside the city. The place was harsh, the land dry and barren, the sun unforgiving. The nights echoed with the cries of hungry children, and the days dragged on in a silence broken only by whispered prayers and the groans of hardship. Supplies were scarce. Food had to be smuggled in secretly by sympathizers, and even then, it was often intercepted. Leaves, dry skins, and scraps became the diet of the exiled. The wealthy were humbled, the poor were tested, and yet the hearts of the believers did not turn. Muhammad bore the suffering alongside his people. He ate as they ate, endured the same thirst, and lay on the same ground. He comforted the anxious and shared what little food was offered to him. His endurance was not born of detachment, but of a deep solidarity with those who had chosen to walk with him. He knew that their sacrifice was not for his sake alone, but for a truth that was larger than all of them. Even those who were not believers, including members of his clan who supported him out of familial duty, witnessed his patience and began to feel the gravity of his mission. The boycott lasted nearly 3 years. Over time, even some of the Quraysh began to see its cruelty. A few among them, moved by conscience, began to speak against the pact. They argued that such a punishment was unworthy of a noble people, and that innocent children and elderly men should not suffer for matters of belief. One day, news spread that insects had eaten the document hanging in the Kaaba, leaving only the name of God untouched. Taking this as a sign, the Quraysh ended the boycott. The exiles returned to Mecca, weary and worn, but with their resolve unbroken. No sooner had the weight of the boycott lifted than new sorrows descended. Within a short time, 2 of the most beloved and crucial figures in Muhammad's life passed away. Khadijah, his wife of 25 years, fell ill and died. Her loss was like the removal of a foundation stone from beneath his feet. She had been his first believer, his counselor, his partner in hardship and peace. In her presence, he had found comfort and sanctuary. Without her, his home felt emptier and his days heavier. Not long after Khadijah's death, Abu Talib also passed away. Though he had never accepted the faith, Abu Talib had been Muhammad's protector since childhood. His support had shielded the Prophet from many of the harsher attempts against his life. With Abu Talib gone, the Quraysh felt emboldened. They no longer feared retribution for insults or attacks. They openly mocked Muhammad in the streets. They threw filth upon him while he prayed. They sent young men to shadow him and harass him. His grief was deepened by the sense of exposure. He had lost not only a wife and an uncle, but the safety that had allowed him to continue preaching in his homeland. In the wake of these losses, Muhammad sought a new path. He turned his eyes to the town of Taif, a settlement nestled among orchards and gardens to the southeast of Mecca. Taif was known for its beauty, its fertile land, and its strong tribal leadership. Muhammad journeyed there with the hope that its people might receive his message and offer him protection. He did not seek refuge out of fear, but out of a desire to continue his mission in a place that might offer fertile ground for truth. He entered Taif quietly and reached out to its leaders. He spoke with them plainly, offering the same message of monotheism and moral reform. He did not demand power or wealth. He asked only for the chance to be heard. But the leaders of Taif responded with scorn. They mocked him to his face and incited the common people against him. As he left the city, a mob was gathered. Stones were hurled at him. He was pelted by children and men alike. His feet bled and his body ached, but he did not raise a hand in anger. He walked with his head bowed, wounded but unbroken, until he found a quiet place outside the city to rest. There, beneath the shade of a tree, he prayed. His words were not a cry for vengeance, but a whisper of trust. He turned to God and said that if his suffering was not a sign of God's anger, then he had no complaint. He asked only for strength to endure and for a way forward. His humility in that moment, when all seemed lost, became a timeless example of grace in trial. In that solitude, something extraordinary happened. A group of jinn, unseen beings created by God, listened as he recited verses of the Quran in prayer. Moved by the words, they believed. Later, he would be informed of this through revelation. Even when people turned away, the message still found its path. Even when stone walls rose before him, unseen hearts opened in secret. That night, though his body was sore and his heart was heavy, he slept knowing that God had not abandoned him. He returned to Mecca quietly. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the persecution had not lessened, yet a change had begun. A few months later, during the season of pilgrimage, he met a group of men from Yathrib, a city to the north of Mecca. They listened to his message and did not reject it. They returned the following year with more companions. They offered their allegiance. They invited him to come to their city and to live among them as a guide and a leader. A door had opened, not where he had expected, but where God had willed. The pain of loss, the failure in Taif, and the long years of rejection had not been without purpose. They had prepared Muhammad and his followers for the journey ahead. Their faith had been tested in the fire, and what emerged was not brokenness, but resilience. The path of prophecy had never promised ease. It had promised truth, and the truth was still unfolding. In the midst of grief and uncertainty, during a time when the Prophet Muhammad faced hostility in his own city and rejection from those he had approached for refuge, a moment arrived that lifted him far beyond the dust and cruelty of the earth. This moment was not a dream, nor was it a vision in the ordinary sense. It was a journey both physical and spiritual, one that would strengthen his heart and confirm for him and his followers that their path, though heavy with trials, was divinely guided and honored beyond measure. One night, as he lay resting near the Kaaba or in the home of a companion according to different reports, the Prophet was awakened by the angel Jibril. He was taken outside where a strange creature awaited him. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Called Burak, it was a white beast, smaller than a mule but larger than a donkey. It moved with a speed that defied imagination. Mounted upon it, the Prophet and Jibril began the first leg of the journey. In the blink of an eye, they were carried from Mecca to Jerusalem, to the sacred precinct known as Masjid al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque. This journey from the Kaaba to Jerusalem would later be known as the Isra. When they arrived, the Prophet dismounted. There he found a gathering of the earlier prophets who had come before him. Among them were Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and many others whose lives were recorded in the divine scriptures. It was not a gathering bound by time or geography. It was a meeting of souls united by the single truth that God is one, and that all prophets, though sent to different peoples, shared a common message and a shared mission. Muhammad led them in prayer, not as a rival but as the final link in the chain, the seal of the prophets. The moment was filled with meaning. It confirmed that his path was not an isolated one but a continuation of the divine tradition stretching back to the beginning of human history. From Jerusalem, the second and more wondrous phase of the journey began. Jibril led the Prophet upwards, through the layers of the heavens. This ascension would come to be known as the Miraj. At each level of the heavens, they encountered prophets from earlier times. First Adam, then Yahya and Isa, then Yusuf, then Idris, then Harun, then Musa, and finally Ibrahim in the highest realm. Each prophet welcomed Muhammad with greetings of peace and honored him as a noble brother. These encounters were not casual. They reminded Muhammad that he stood upon the shoulders of those who had also endured rejection, hardship, and loss. Their welcomes were affirmations that his mission was righteous and that his trials were part of a divine legacy. Beyond the realms of the known, the Prophet was taken to a place where the veil between the human and the divine grew thin. He reached what was known as the Lot tree of the utmost boundary, a place that even the angel Jibril could not cross. There, alone in the presence of the Most High, he was granted an experience that cannot be fully conveyed by words. The details were beyond the reach of human comprehension, and the Prophet himself would later speak of that encounter only in the most careful and respectful terms. But from that divine presence, he returned not only with spiritual reassurance but with a gift that would become central to the life of every Muslim. During that sacred meeting, the Prophet was given the command for prayer. At first, it was prescribed as 50 daily prayers. As he descended and passed once more by Moses, the elder prophet advised him to return and ask for a reduction. Moses, who had led his own people, knew the weight of human weakness. Muhammad returned to God and humbly requested a lessening of the burden. Again and again, he ascended and descended, each time the number reduced until it became 5. Moses urged him to continue, believing even 5 might be difficult for people to maintain. But Muhammad, out of reverence and a sense of divine mercy, said he could not go back again. These 5 prayers, though small in number, would carry the full reward of the original 50. Thus was prayer established as the daily connection between the human and the divine. It was not merely a ritual, but a rope that would link hearts to heaven. For the Prophet and his followers, the prayers would become a source of strength, discipline, and serenity, drawing them back to God throughout the day, reminding them that even amid the chaos of life, their true purpose remained constant. The Prophet returned to Mecca that night. The entire journey, from the Kaaba to Jerusalem to the heavens and back again, had taken place within a single night. When dawn broke, he began to speak of what he had seen. He described the journey to those around him with clarity and certainty. Some listened in disbelief, others mocked him openly. Among them were those who had been waiting for such a moment, hoping to expose him as a liar or a madman. They spread the story quickly, laughing and asking if people would really believe a man who claimed to have traveled to the farthest mosque and beyond the heavens in one night. They approached Abu Bakr, hoping he would be shaken by the tale. But when he heard what Muhammad had said, he did not hesitate. If Muhammad said it, he replied, then it must be true. His faith was not blind, but built upon years of knowing the man who had never lied. From that moment, he was honored with the title Al-Siddiq, the truthful supporter. To those who mocked, the Prophet offered no arguments. But when challenged, he described in precise detail the features of Masjid al-Aqsa, which he had never seen before with his physical eyes. He even described a caravan he had passed during his journey, naming its details and foretelling its time of arrival. When it came exactly as he had said, some hearts began to waver. But belief, as always, remained a choice. Some held tightly to disbelief, others drew closer to the light. For the Prophet himself, the night journey and ascension were more than miracles. They were a divine reassurance, a sign that he was not alone and that the weight he bore was honored in the heavens as well as on earth. The timing of the event was no accident. It came after the loss of Khadijah and Abu Talib, after the bitterness of Taif, during a time of deep emotional and social isolation. Just when the burden had seemed too much to carry, God lifted his messenger above the clouds and showed him the beauty and vastness of the truth he had been entrusted to deliver. This journey would become a symbol for believers of the infinite mercy and might of God, of the dignity of the Prophet, and of the closeness between prayer and the divine presence. In every prostration, a believer would recall that Muhammad had stood before the Creator, and in that memory, hearts would find peace. The message of Islam had taken root in Mecca, but the soil had grown increasingly hostile. 13 years of preaching had yielded small numbers of faithful followers, but endless waves of rejection and persecution. The Quraysh had grown bolder in their efforts to silence Muhammad. He had endured insults, threats, and physical harm, and his followers had suffered even more. Some had fled to Abyssinia, where a just Christian king had granted them refuge. Those who remained in Mecca lived under constant fear. Yet despite the pressure, the Prophet did not waver. He continued to teach and call with patience, never once compromising the message he had been entrusted with. But the time was coming when Mecca would no longer be able to contain the growing force of revelation. Far to the north of Mecca lay a city known as Yathrib, later to be called Medina. It was a place of fertile land, scattered with palm groves and wells, inhabited by 2 major Arab tribes and several Jewish communities. For years, the people of Yathrib had suffered from bitter tribal wars. Generations of bloodshed had left deep wounds, and the desire for peace had begun to outweigh the pride of vengeance. Some among them had heard of a prophet who spoke of unity, mercy, and justice. During the pilgrimage season in Mecca, a group from Yathrib encountered Muhammad. He spoke with them and shared the words of the Quran. Their hearts were stirred. They believed in him and returned to their city with the seeds of faith. The next year, 12 men returned. They met with the Prophet in secret near the outskirts of Mecca, at a place called Aqaba. There they pledged themselves to him, not as a political leader, but as a messenger of God. They promised to worship none but Allah, to uphold moral conduct, and to support him in his mission. They were simple promises, but they marked a shift. The call to Islam was no longer confined to Mecca. A new door had opened, and the light of revelation began to spread beyond its birthplace. The following year, 75 people from Yathrib, including both men and women, came to pledge their allegiance. They came not only as individuals, but as representatives of a community ready to welcome the Prophet into their midst. They offered him protection and loyalty, promising that if he migrated to their city, they would defend him as they would their own kin. This was not a decision made lightly. It meant inviting hostility from the Quraysh, risking conflict and upheaval. But they saw in Muhammad not a threat, but a hope for a better future. He accepted their pledge and instructed his followers in Mecca to begin preparing for migration. The command to emigrate did not come without risk. The Quraysh realized that the Muslims were leaving, and they feared what would happen if Muhammad established a secure base elsewhere. They gathered in secret to devise a plan. Some argued for exile, others for imprisonment, but the most ruthless among them insisted on assassination. They agreed to send a group of young men, each from a different tribe, to strike Muhammad simultaneously, thereby making it impossible for any single tribe to be held accountable. The plan was set, and the men waited outside the Prophet's home on the appointed night, armed and ready. But God's protection was already at work. That night, Muhammad instructed his cousin Ali to sleep in his bed, wrapped in his cloak. Then he slipped away in the darkness, accompanied by his closest companion, Abu Bakr. As they departed the city, they headed not toward Yathrib, but south, toward the rugged caves of Mount Thar, in order to throw off any pursuit. There they hid for 3 days while the Quraysh scoured the surrounding desert in search of them. At one point, their pursuers came so close that Abu Bakr feared they would be discovered. Muhammad reassured him with calm words. "Do not grieve, for God is with us." It was a moment of profound trust, a testament to the strength of faith that had been forged through years of trial. When the danger had passed, they resumed their journey northward. The road to Yathrib was long and harsh, crossing scorching plains and barren hills. But with each step, they drew closer to a new beginning. Word of the Prophet's migration spread ahead of him. In Yathrib, the people waited anxiously, scanning the horizon each day for signs of his arrival. When at last he appeared on the outskirts of the city, riding with the sun at his back, a cry of joy rose from the hearts of those who had believed without ever having seen him. He entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a guest. The people of Yathrib, now known as the Ansar or helpers, offered him their homes, their wealth, and their loyalty. But Muhammad did not seek privilege. He allowed his camel to wander freely, saying it was guided by God. It stopped in an open area belonging to 2 orphan boys, and there he decided to settle. A simple mosque was built on that spot, made of mud bricks and palm trunks. It was both a place of prayer and a gathering point for the community. The Prophet's own dwelling was built beside it, modest in size and humble in appearance. Medina quickly became a different kind of city. Under Muhammad's guidance, it was no longer defined by tribal divisions or class distinctions. He established bonds of brotherhood between the migrants from Mecca, known as the Muhajirun, and the Ansar. Each pair shared what they had, supporting one another in both material and spiritual ways. This act of unity was unprecedented in Arabia, where tribal loyalty had always eclipsed every other bond. Now, faith became the tie that bound hearts. The Prophet also laid the foundation for a just and inclusive society. He drafted a charter that outlined the rights and responsibilities of all residents of Medina, including Jews and other non-Muslim tribes. It was a declaration of mutual protection, freedom of religion, and shared responsibility for the defense and welfare of the city. This charter, sometimes referred to as the Constitution of Medina, was one of the earliest known documents of its kind in the world, reflecting principles of pluralism and justice that were far ahead of their time. In Medina, the Prophet was not only a spiritual leader but also a statesman, a judge, and a guide in every aspect of life. He led by example, living simply, sharing meals with the poor, and responding to the needs of the people with compassion and wisdom. The mosque became the heart of the community, a place of prayer, education, and counsel. From this humble base, the message of Islam began to spread with renewed strength. The migration marked a turning point. It was not an escape but a deliberate step toward the fulfillment of a mission. It transformed Islam from a persecuted movement into a living society. It gave the Prophet and his followers the freedom to worship, to build, to serve, and to lead. Though challenges remained and the shadow of conflict still loomed, the community had taken root. What had begun in the secrecy of Mecca nights was now rising in the open light of Medina's days, steady and unstoppable. Life in Medina brought stability to the Muslim community, but it also introduced new responsibilities and greater challenges. Muhammad was now not only a prophet but a head of state and the guide of a diverse and rapidly growing society. The city had become a sanctuary for faith, but it was not immune from danger. The Quraysh of Mecca, humiliated by Muhammad's successful migration and alarmed by the growing strength of Islam, were not content to let him establish peace in the north. Their pride and power were intertwined with the religious and commercial status of Mecca, and the rise of a rival city, united under a new faith, threatened everything they held sacred. In Medina, Muhammad worked tirelessly to organize the community, establish systems of justice, and ensure mutual respect among the various tribes and religious groups that shared the city. Yet the threat from Mecca could not be ignored. The Quraysh had seized the property and homes of the emigrants, driving them out of their birthplace with nothing. Caravans loaded with goods continued to move between Mecca and Syria, often passing near Medina. These caravans were symbols of Quraysh wealth and power, funded in part by the stolen belongings of the Muslims. The situation was not only economic but deeply personal. Permission was given through revelation for the Muslims to defend themselves. It was a turning point. For years they had endured persecution in silence. Now they were allowed to protect their lives and their freedom. When word reached Medina that a major Quraysh caravan led by Abu Sufyan was returning from Syria, Muhammad called upon his followers to intercept it. The aim was not indiscriminate aggression, but a message that the days of passive suffering were over. However, the caravan managed to escape, and the Quraysh, determined to crush Muhammad once and for all, marched from Mecca with a force of over 1,000 men. The two sides met at a place called Badr, a dry plain surrounded by low hills and wells. The Muslim force numbered barely over 300. They were lightly armed, without horses or armor. But their hearts were firm, their purpose clear, and their faith unshakable. They did not fight for conquest or revenge. They fought because they believed that truth must be defended, that freedom to worship must be protected, and that justice was worth the risk of death. On the morning of the battle, Muhammad stood before his companions and prayed with intensity, his hands raised high, asking for divine help. If this small group perished, he said, there would be none left to carry the message of Islam. What followed was a victory so decisive and so unexpected that it changed the course of history. Despite their smaller numbers and limited means, the Muslims triumphed. Several leading figures of Quraysh were killed, including many of those who had persecuted the early believers. 70 were taken captive. Muhammad treated the prisoners with dignity and mercy. Many were released upon ransom or in exchange for teaching literacy to Muslim children. This treatment left an impression even among those who had opposed him. The victory at Badr confirmed for the believers that their cause was just and that God supported those who stood for what was right. But the path ahead was not without setbacks. The following year, the Quraysh returned to the battlefield with a larger and more determined army. Muhammad consulted his companions, and it was agreed that they would meet the enemy outside Medina at the foot of Mount Uhud. The battle began with early gains for the Muslims, but a critical mistake changed the tide. A group of archers stationed on a hill, tasked with protecting the rear, left their position prematurely, thinking the battle was won. This allowed a Quraysh cavalry unit to circle around and strike from behind. Chaos spread, and many Muslims were killed. The Prophet himself was wounded. Blood flowed from his face, and he was struck by stones. Yet he remained calm, retreating only when absolutely necessary, calling his companions to regroup. Though the Quraysh failed to capture Medina, the Battle of Uhud was a painful lesson. It reminded the Muslims that discipline and unity were essential. It also showed that even the Prophet, beloved and divinely guided, was not shielded from hardship. But the defeat did not break the spirit of the community. They healed, rebuilt, and remained vigilant. The next great challenge came in the form of a siege. 5 years after the migration, news arrived that a vast coalition of Meccan and allied tribes was marching toward Medina with the intent of wiping Islam from the earth. The Muslims, vastly outnumbered, prepared to defend their city. On the advice of a companion named Salman, a Persian who had once been a slave, they dug a trench around the vulnerable parts of Medina. It was a tactic unknown to Arab warfare and proved to be decisive. When the enemy arrived, they found the city fortified in a way they could not breach. The siege dragged on for weeks. Supplies grew scarce. Cold winds battered the camp. Doubt crept into the hearts of the enemy, while the Muslims held firm. Then, as hope seemed to fade, a fierce storm scattered the enemy camp, and the coalition withdrew in disarray. This event, remembered as the Battle of the Trench, marked the beginning of the end for the Quraysh. They had brought all their strength to Medina and had failed. Islam was no longer a fragile movement. It was a force rooted in faith and now seasoned by trial. After this, the Prophet began to reach beyond the borders of Arabia. Letters were sent to emperors and kings, inviting them to consider the message of Islam. While some responded with curiosity and others with hostility, the effort signaled the universal nature of his mission. Islam was not a tribal religion. It was a call to all people, regardless of lineage or land. In the 6th year after the migration, the Prophet and his followers set out for Mecca, not to fight, but to perform pilgrimage. They were unarmed, dressed in simple garments, seeking only to visit the sacred house. The Quraysh, suspicious and defensive, barred them from entering. Yet rather than respond with violence, the Prophet entered into negotiations. The result was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, a 10-year truce between the two sides. Though the terms seemed unfavorable at first, the treaty was a masterstroke. It allowed safe passage, reduced hostilities, and gave Islam the opportunity to spread without interference. During this time of peace, conversions increased dramatically. People who had feared open association with the Muslims now came forward. The Prophet continued to teach, to lead, and to build the community with justice and humility. 2 years later, when the Quraysh violated the treaty by attacking an allied tribe of the Muslims, Muhammad responded with a show of strength. He gathered a vast army and marched toward Mecca. But unlike the many conquerors who had ravaged cities throughout history, Muhammad entered Mecca without bloodshed. The people surrendered, and he declared a general amnesty. Those who had persecuted him, driven him from his home, and waged war against him for years were forgiven. He walked to the Kaaba, surrounded by thousands of silent companions, and removed the idols that had long filled its sacred space. He restored it to the pure worship of the one God. The conquest of Mecca was not marked by revenge or cruelty, but by mercy and renewal. The Prophet stood in the very city that had once cast him out and proclaimed that no superiority belonged to any man except through righteousness. With Mecca now peacefully under his leadership and the Kaaba restored to the worship of one God, the mission that had begun in the silence of a cave reached its zenith. In the years that followed the conquest of Mecca, tribes across Arabia began sending delegations to Medina, seeking to learn more about the new faith and often embracing it themselves. The message of Islam, once whispered in secrecy and carried on the backs of a few persecuted believers, had now become a force that united people who had once been divided by blood feuds and tribal enmity. Yet the Prophet remained as humble as ever, living simply, walking among his people, and continuing to teach by word and example. Though political power and social order had shifted dramatically, Muhammad never assumed the posture of a ruler in the conventional sense. His home remained small and modest. He slept on a simple mat, mended his own clothes, and greeted visitors with warmth and sincerity. He walked in the markets, prayed in the mosque shoulder to shoulder with the poor and the wealthy alike, and listened patiently to the concerns of every person who came to him. He was not distant or guarded. He was among the people, approachable and compassionate, even as the entire peninsula now recognized him as both a spiritual guide and a temporal leader. His message had not changed from the first day it was revealed to him. He continued to call people to the oneness of God, to honesty, compassion, humility, and justice. The Quran was still being revealed, responding to events, guiding the community, and offering clarity in moments of uncertainty. It spoke to personal behavior, to social obligations, to treaties and commerce, to ethics and worship. The Muslims preserved these revelations with care, memorizing each verse and recording it in writing. These verses became not only a source of law and guidance, but a source of comfort and beauty, shaping the character of the growing community. In the 10th year after the migration, the Prophet announced his intention to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. This would be his first and only complete Hajj since the beginning of his mission. Tens of thousands joined him on the journey. They gathered on the plains of Arafat, standing in unison, clothed in simple white garments, shedding all distinctions of class and tribe. There, during the farewell pilgrimage, the Prophet addressed the people with words that would become etched in the memory of generations to come. He reminded them of the sanctity of life, the equality of all people regardless of race or background, and the responsibilities they bore to one another. He spoke of the rights of women, the importance of honesty in trade, and the need to remain united. He told them that no one had superiority over another except by virtue of righteousness. His voice carried across the plains, reaching not only the ears of those present but echoing through the hearts of those who would hear his words centuries later. He asked them if he had fulfilled his mission, and when they responded in the affirmative, he raised his hands and called upon God to bear witness. Soon after this pilgrimage, a verse was revealed. It declared that the religion had been perfected, that the favor of God had been completed, and that Islam had been established as the true way of life. Many of the companions wept when they heard it. They understood that the mission was now fulfilled and that the Prophet's time among them was nearing its end. Not long after returning to Medina, the Prophet fell ill. At first it seemed like a simple fever. He continued to lead prayers and advise the people, but the illness did not pass. It grew worse, and the pain became more intense. He sought no luxury or special treatment. He spent his final days in the room of his wife Aisha, resting his head on her chest, his body weak but his spirit firm. Even in illness, he thought not of himself but of his people. He reminded them to treat the vulnerable with kindness, to uphold the prayer, and to remain faithful to their covenant with God. When he could no longer lead the prayer himself, he instructed that Abu Bakr should do so in his place. This was a silent but clear indication of who would continue the leadership of the community. On one morning, the Prophet lifted the curtain of his room and looked into the mosque. The companions were lined up in prayer behind Abu Bakr. A faint smile crossed the Prophet's face. It was a moment of peace, seeing that the community stood strong, united, and faithful. Later that day, he passed away. His head rested gently against Aisha, and his lips moved with his final words. He reminded the people to hold fast to prayer and to care for those under their protection. He then spoke of the highest companion, a phrase understood to mean the presence of God, and his soul departed. The news of his passing spread quickly, and grief swept through Medina like a wave. Many companions could not accept the reality. Umar, overcome with sorrow, stood and declared that Muhammad had not died and would return. But Abu Bakr, with clarity and strength, addressed the people. He reminded them that Muhammad was a messenger of God, and that messengers had come and gone before him. He recited the verse that confirmed the truth, and the people wept, their hearts accepting what their minds had resisted. The Prophet was buried in the very room where he had died, a simple resting place for the man who had changed the course of human history. There was no grand monument, no golden tomb. What remained was not a structure of stone, but a living legacy etched into the lives of those who had known him and carried his message forward. In the years that followed, Islam would spread beyond the borders of Arabia. Empires would rise and fall. Languages would change, cultures would evolve, and the world would shift in countless ways. Yet the example of Muhammad would remain a constant. His words, preserved in the Quran and in the sayings of those who knew him, would continue to inspire. His life, marked by humility, courage, patience, and love, would serve as a guide not only for worship, but for how to live with purpose and dignity. He left behind no wealth, no inheritance of gold or land. What he left was something far more enduring. He left a path. He left a way of being in the world that called each soul toward what is higher, purer, and more just. His life had begun in the arms of loss, orphaned before he could speak, and it ended in the arms of love, surrounded by a community that had grown from a few believers in secret to a nation of hearts joined by faith. Thus closed the life of the Prophet Muhammad, not with fanfare or conquest, but with fulfillment. The final revelation had been delivered, the trust had been honored, the lamp had been lit, and its light continues to shine.